When everything was finished, when the heavens were set in place, when the earth stood complete in all its vast beauty, God did not rush to do more. He did not add noise. He did not prove anything further. Creation stood silent, not because God was tired, but because the work was perfect. Completion itself declared His glory. The seventh day arrived not as an afterthought, but as a statement. God finished what He started, and then He stopped, because rest is not weakness, rest is authority. Only a God who is fully in control can choose to pause, and when God rested, He was not stepping back from power. He was defining rhythm. He was teaching the universe a lesson humanity still struggles to learn, that life is not sustained by constant striving but by trust. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because rest in His presence is sacred. Rest is where identity is restored, purpose is clarified, strength is renewed. This was not just about one day in history. This was a message for every generation that feels burned out, overwhelmed, and constantly chasing more. God showed that productivity without peace is incomplete, success without rest is empty, and movement without meaning leads to collapse. The same God who spoke galaxies into existence chose stillness to mark completion, because rest reminds us that the world does not depend on our effort, it depends on His faithfulness. When you stop, you are not falling behind, you are acknowledging that God is ahead. When you rest, you are not quitting, you are aligning with divine order. God rested so that humanity would know that their value is not in endless work but in relationship. This is why rest is holy, because it restores the soul, reconnects the heart, and refocuses the mind. The seventh day stands as a quiet but powerful declaration that God finishes His work, and He finishes it well. And if the Creator of all things pauses, then you are allowed to breathe too. You are allowed to stop striving. You are allowed to trust that what God has begun in your life, He will complete. The same God who completed creation is completing you. The same God who blessed rest is inviting you into peace, not because everything is easy but because He is in control. And when you rest in Him, you are not escaping responsibility, you are stepping into faith, because real strength is not found in never stopping. Real strength is found in knowing when to rest in God and let Him work. When God rested on the seventh day, it did not mean the story ended, it meant a deeper chapter began, because rest was never about stopping the mission, it was about trusting the one who holds it together. The silence of the seventh day was louder than the thunder of creation itself, because in that silence God taught a truth humanity keeps forgetting, that control is an illusion and faith is the foundation. The world today is loud, rushed, and restless. Everyone is running, chasing, building, proving, surviving, yet God still whispers the same ancient message: come and rest, not because you are weak, but because you are human. And when you refuse to rest, you begin to believe the lie that everything depends on you, but nothing ever did. The universe was complete before you breathed your first breath, and it will continue, because God is faithful, not because you are exhausted trying to hold it together. Rest is resistance against fear, rest is rebellion against anxiety, rest is worship, because when you rest, you are declaring that God is still God even when you stop moving. This is why the seventh day was blessed, because it confronts our pride, it humbles our ego, and exposes our addiction to control. Many people fear rest because silence forces them to face what noise hides: the doubts, the pain, the unanswered prayers, the waiting seasons. But God does not fear your silence, He meets you there. The same Spirit that hovered over the waters in the beginning still hovers over the chaos of your life. waiting for you to stop running and start trusting the truth as God often does His deepest work in your life when you are still, not when you are striving, not when you are forcing outcomes, but when you surrender. Rest is not inactivity, it is alignment. It is choosing God's pace over panic. It is believing that delay is not denial and waiting is not weakness. Look at creation. God spoke light and it obeyed. God spoke order and chaos retreated. But when it was finished, He did not speak, He rested, because completion does not require noise, and neither does faith. Some of you are tired not because you are doing too much, but because you are carrying what God never asked you to carry. Burdens meant for Him, expectations meant for grace, timelines meant for eternity. God never designed you to live in constant urgency. Your soul was created for rhythm, breath, worship, work, rest, repeat, and when that rhythm breaks, the soul begins to crack. That is why Jesus later said, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He was not offering sleep, He was offering restoration, because rest in God heals what effort cannot fix. You can work endlessly and still feel empty, but one moment of true rest in God can restore years of exhaustion. This is why the seventh day matters. It reveals the heart of God, a God who finishes His work and invites His children to trust Him enough to stop. The problem is we live in a culture that glorifies burnout, calls exhaustion ambition, and labels rest as laziness, but heaven does not reward burnout, it rewards obedience, and obedience sometimes looks like stopping even when the world says keep going. God rested not because He was drained, but because the work was complete and He wanted creation to enjoy what was made. Many of you never enjoy what God has already given because you are too busy chasing what you think is missing. You prayed for breakthrough but never paused to thank God for survival. You asked for open doors but ignored the strength He gave you to endure closed ones. Rest teaches gratitude, rest teaches awareness, rest teaches humility, because when you rest you admit that God is sufficient even when you are not strong. The seventh day also teaches boundaries. God separated light from darkness, land from sea, work from rest, because boundaries protect what matters. When you ignore rest, you blur those boundaries and confusion follows. Anxiety increases, joy fades, faith weakens, because exhaustion distorts perspective. Elijah saw fire fall from heaven but later collapsed under a tree, asking God to take his life, not because God failed but because Elijah was depleted. And what did God do? He did not rebuke him, He fed him, He let him sleep, because sometimes spiritual warfare is won with rest, not with more effort. Some of you are fighting battles you should be resting through, trusting God to fight for you. The enemy loves exhausted believers because tired faith is easier to shake, but rested faith is rooted, grounded, unmovable. This is why Sabbath is spiritual warfare. It reminds hell that God is still in control even when His people stop striving. Rest is not an escape from responsibility, it is preparation for destiny. God rested before humanity was fully revealed because Adam was created into rest, not exhaustion. His first full day was not work but relationship, and that is God's design. Intimacy before productivity, identity before labor. And if your life is built only on work without rest, you will eventually lose yourself. Rest resets perspective. It reminds you who you are and whose you are. You are not your output, you are not your results, you are not your failures. You are a creation loved, sustained, and guided by God. When you rest, you return to truth, and truth sets you free. Many people fear rest because they are afraid God will not show up, but rest is where God shows up most clearly because noise competes with His voice, silence invites it. The seventh day whispers a promise that God is still working even when you are. Not that His plans do not collapse when you pause, and that His timing is perfect even when yours feels delayed. Rest trains your heart to wait without fear, trust without proof, and believe without control, and that is why rest is holy, because holiness is not about perfection, it is about surrender, and surrender begins when you stop trying to be God and let God be God. Before God ever shakes the earth, He stills the soul. Before He opens doors, He closes mouths. Before He announces victory, He hides the process, because silence is not absence, silence is preparation. The Bible never says God stopped working on the seventh day. It says He rested, which means His power never left the scene. It simply moved in a way that could not be seen. This is how God often works. He builds the future in silence while the world expects noise. Most people think if God is moving they will feel it, hear it, see it immediately, but Scripture tells a different story. Joseph dreamed loudly but waited silently. Moses heard God's voice but spent 40 years in obscurity. David was anointed king but returned to the fields. Jesus Himself lived 30 years in silence before 3 years changed eternity. God is never rushed and He is never random. Silence is not delay, silence is design, because if God revealed everything He was doing before you were ready, you would sabotage it with fear, impatience, or pride. That is why He hides the roots before revealing the fruit. When God is quiet, it is often because He is doing something too deep to explain, too precise to rush, and too holy to expose early. Some of you feel abandoned because heaven feels silent, but what if that silence is God protecting the miracle He is forming? What if the delay is not rejection but refinement? What if the quiet season is where your character is being shaped to carry the calling you asked for? God's silence is not punishment, it is partnership, because faith is trusting God when there is no evidence yet. When creation was finished, the earth was complete, but nothing changed visually on the seventh day, yet something eternal was established: rhythm, trust, order. Rest, that invisible foundation, still governs life today. The same is true in your life. God may not be changing your circumstances yet, but He is changing you, and when you change the way you stand in the storm no longer controls you. Silence teaches discernment, it sharpens spiritual hearing, because when everything is loud you confuse emotion with direction, but silence forces you to listen deeper. God often removes noise so you can recognize His voice. Some of you are praying for clarity, while God is asking you to be still, because clarity comes when striving stops. The enemy wants you panicking, rushing, making decisions from fear, but God waits in the stillness, because peace is the confirmation of His presence. Elijah did not find God in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a still small voice, because God does not need to overpower to be powerful. He does not need spectacle to be sovereign. Silence is where faith grows roots, because faith built on noise collapses when the noise stops. But faith built in silence, there comes a moment when rest stops feeling like waiting and starts feeling like awakening, because rest is never the end of the story, it is the doorway to resurrection power. God never rests to remain still, He rests to release something greater. And this is the part most people misunderstand. They think rest is passive, but in God's kingdom rest is active. Rest is where power gathers. Rest is where heaven aligns. Rest is where resurrection is prepared. The tomb was silent before it was empty. The Earth was still before it was filled. The seventh day was quiet before history continued, and the same pattern repeats in your life. The silence you are walking through is not a grave, it is a womb. Something is forming beneath the surface, something is shifting in the unseen, and when the time is right it will rise suddenly, powerfully, undeniably. Resurrection power never announces itself early, it arrives fully formed, because God does not resurrect fragments, He resurrects fully prepared purpose. Many people want resurrection without rest, they want victory without surrender, breakthrough without waiting, glory without obedience. But God does not bypass process, because process protects promise. The rest God calls you into is not comfort, it is consecration, it is separation from noise, distraction, pride and fear, because resurrection power cannot flow through a heart that refuses to be still. When God rested after creation, He was not done revealing His power, He was establishing authority. Because only someone who is fully confident in their power can afford to pause. God rested to show that creation does not control Him, and when you rest in God, you are declaring that your circumstances do not control you. Resurrection power begins when fear loses its grip and trust takes its place. Look at Jesus. He did not rush the cross, He did not escape suffering, He surrendered to the Father fully and completely, and because He rested in the will of God, even death could not hold Him. Resurrection power flows from obedience, not resistance. Many of you are fighting seasons God is asking you to rest in, and because you resist, you feel stuck, frustrated, drained. But the moment you surrender, the moment you stop forcing outcomes and start trusting timing, the atmosphere shifts. Resurrection power is released when you stop trying to resurrect yourself and allow God to do it His way. Lazarus did not walk out of the tomb because he struggled harder, he walked out because he responded to the voice of Jesus. Rest positions you to hear that voice. Striving drowns it out, fear distorts it, pride ignores it, but rest tunes your spirit to heaven, and when God speaks, life must respond. Some of you feel buried, forgotten, sealed behind stones of disappointment, betrayal, delay and unanswered prayers, but hear this clearly: stones do not stop God. Silence does not cancel destiny, and death does not have the final word. Resurrection power does not depend on conditions, it depends on God, and the same God who rested on the seventh day rose on the third, because rest does not weaken power, it concentrates it. The waiting season you are in is storing strength, wisdom, discernment and endurance for what is coming next. When resurrection power hits your life, it will not look small, it will not look accidental, it will not look rushed, it will look intentional, undeniable and God orchestrated, because resurrection always glorifies God, not human effort. This is why God allows some things to die, because dead things cannot take credit, only God can receive glory for resurrection. Some of you are grieving versions of yourself that no longer exist, dreams that collapsed, plans that failed, relationships that ended, but what feels like loss may actually be divine pruning. Because God will not resurrect what limits you, He resurrects what aligns with His purpose. Rest allows old things to die so new life can rise, and this is the part that scares people, because death feels final, but in God death is never final, it is transitional. When Jesus rested in the tomb, the disciples thought it was over, but heaven knew Sunday was coming. Rest often looks like defeat before it reveals victory. Resurrection power is unleashed when patience meets promise, faith meets obedience, and surrender meets timing. God is not slow, He is precise, He waits until hope is exhausted so faith can stand alone, because resurrection faith does not rely on evidence, it relies on God's character, and when resurrection power hits, it changes everything. It changes how you see yourself, how you face opposition, how you carry authority, because once you have seen God bring life out of death, you are no longer controlled by fear of loss. You know that if God allowed it to end, He is powerful enough to bring it back. Transformed, elevated and purified. Resurrection power is not just about miracles, it is about mindset. It shifts you from panic to peace, from striving to trust, from survival to purpose. Rest prepares your heart to carry Resurrection without corruption, because power without rest leads to pride, but power born from rest leads to humility, gratitude, and obedience. The seventh day teaches that God finishes his work, but resurrection teaches that God continues his work, and the space between the two is where faith is refined. Resurrection power is not rushed, it is revealed, and when it comes it does not whisper, it speaks with authority, clarity, and purpose. And when God finally moves, after silence, after rest, after waiting, there will be no confusion, no doubt, no question. It will be clear that only God could have done this. There is a truth most people never hear preached because it is uncomfortable, unsettling, and deeply confronting, and that truth is this: if you refuse to rest when God invites you, he will eventually force rest for your protection, not your punishment. Because God is not cruel, but he is serious about your soul. Many people think exhaustion is normal, burnout is success, and stress is the price of destiny, but heaven sees it differently. Heaven sees exhaustion as a warning sign, not a badge of honor. God never designed you to live disconnected from rest, because rest is not laziness, it is alignment, and when alignment is broken, collapse follows, not because God is angry, but because the structure cannot sustain itself without his order. This is where many strong people fall, not weak people, strong people, talented people, gifted people, disciplined people, driven people who confuse momentum with purpose and activity with obedience. They keep moving even when God says pause, they keep building even when God says wait, they keep pushing even when God says be still, and eventually God steps in, not to destroy the work but to save the worker. Forced rest often arrives disguised as crisis, illness, loss, delay, shutdown, betrayal, or failure, because when whispers are ignored, God raises his voice, and when his voice is ignored, he allows circumstances to speak, because silence did not stop you, signs did not slow you, warnings did not change you. So God allows stillness through surrender you did not choose. Forced rest feels cruel when it arrives, but merciful when you understand it later. Many of you listening right now are not under attack, you are under intervention. God is not punishing you, he is preserving you, because had he allowed you to continue at that pace, with that pride, with that pressure, with that independence, you would have broken permanently. Forced rest is heaven's emergency brake, because God values your life more than your productivity, your soul more than your schedule, your obedience more than your applause. Look at Elijah the prophet, who called fire down from heaven, outran chariots, and confronted kings, still collapsed under a tree begging to die. And what did God do? He did not rebuke him, he did not lecture him, he fed him, let him sleep, and restored him, because even spiritual giants need rest, and when they refuse, God intervenes. Moses was hidden for 40 years before being sent back. David was pulled off the battlefield and pushed into caves. Joseph was thrown into prison. Paul was blinded. Job was stripped. Jesus himself was led into the wilderness. Forced rest is never random, it is strategic, and its purpose is to remove what cannot go with you into the next season, because if God does not stop you now, what you are carrying will destroy you later. Forced rest breaks addiction to control, because control is the enemy of faith. You cannot trust God fully while gripping outcomes tightly. Forced rest exposes idols, productivity, image, validation, success, approval, because when everything stops, whatever you panic about reveals what you worship, and God refuses to compete with idols, he removes them. Forced rest humbles pride, because pride says I cannot stop, humility says I trust God enough to stop and survive. Forced rest realigns identity, because many people do not know who they are without movement, applause, deadlines, and achievement, and God says you are not what you do, you are who I called. Forced rest feels like death to the ego, but resurrection to the spirit, and this is where transformation happens, in silence, when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, when no one is validating, when all you have left is God, and that is enough. Forced rest is uncomfortable because it exposes wounds, distractions kept Hidden trauma, pain, grief, insecurity, fear, and unanswered questions rise to the surface, but healing cannot happen without exposure. God brings you into stillness not to shame you but to heal you, because wounds ignored become infections, and infections eventually kill purpose. Forced rest slows your body so your soul can catch up. Many of you moved faster than your character matured, faster than your faith deepened, faster than your discernment developed, and God in His mercy stopped the momentum so the foundation could be strengthened, because elevation without stability leads to collapse, and God will not promote what He has not prepared. Forced rest teaches dependence again, because independence is subtle rebellion. It whispers, "I can handle this," without God, but forced rest removes options until prayer becomes your only language and surrender your only strategy, and in that place you discover something powerful. God is still God even when you are still, and He still works even when you stop. Forced rest does not mean God abandoned you, it means He is closer than ever, refining, restoring, recalibrating, and rebuilding you from the inside out. When the seventh day came, God rested to bless what He created. When forced rest comes, God is preparing to bless what He will release through you next. But blessing requires capacity, and rest increases capacity. You cannot carry future anointing with current exhaustion. Forced rest is not the end, it is preparation for resurrection, authority, and sustainable impact. When God restarts your life after forced rest, you will move differently, slower, wiser, stronger, humbler, clearer, less desperate, less driven by fear, more anchored in trust, because you learned the cost of ignoring God's rhythm. Forced there is a kind of rest that does not come naturally to the human heart, because it requires trust instead of effort, surrender instead of control, obedience instead of impulse, and this is the rest God calls His people into. Obedient rest is not accidental, it is intentional, it is chosen again and again in a world that rewards speed, noise, urgency, and pressure. Obedient rest is a decision to move at God's pace even when everything around you demands hurry. This is where most believers struggle, because trusting God with outcomes feels riskier than exhausting yourself trying to manage everything. But obedient rest is not passive waiting, it is active alignment. It is choosing God's rhythm over survival mode, because survival mode may keep you alive, but it will never make you whole. God's rhythm was established from the beginning: work, then rest, creation, then pause, movement, then stillness, not as a suggestion but as a design. And whenever humanity violates divine design, consequences follow. Not because God is harsh, but because reality responds to truth whether you acknowledge it or not. Obedient rest begins with recognizing that you were never meant to carry everything alone. Self-reliance looks strong, but it slowly drains faith, because it shifts dependence from God to effort. Obedient rest brings dependence back where it belongs, and dependence is not weakness, it is wisdom, because only God sees the full picture while you only see fragments. Obedience means resting even when the work looks unfinished, even when the bills are due, even when the pressure is loud, even when fear says if you stop everything will fall apart. Because obedient rest declares, if everything depends on me. It was never God's plan to begin with. The Sabbath was not given to limit humanity, it was given to protect them, and the same principle applies today. Rest protects clarity, judgment, health, relationships, faith, and purpose. Without rest, discernment weakens, and when discernment weakens, people make permanent decisions based on temporary exhaustion. Obedient rest trains you to pause before reacting, listen before deciding, and pray before moving, because rushing decisions is one of the enemy's favorite tools. He cannot always stop God's plan, but he can rush you into destroying it yourself. Obedience slows you down enough to hear God clearly, because God rarely shouts over chaos, He waits for stillness. Obedient rest is built through small daily choices, choosing silence over noise, prayer over panic, trust over control, gratitude over anxiety, and presence over distraction. It is not about one day a week only, it is about a posture of the heart, a lifestyle that honors God's timing, because timing matters. Even obedience done at the wrong time can create damage. Abraham obeyed God by having a son but rushed the promise, and Ishmael was born. Moses obeyed God by defending his people but moved before God sent him and spent 40 years in the wilderness. Obedience without rest becomes impulsive. Obedience with rest becomes precise. Obedient rest also requires boundaries, because rest cannot exist without limits. Limits on work, limits on availability, limits on people, limits on expectations, even limits on ministry, because saying yes to everything is not faith, it is fear disguised as sacrifice. Jesus healed crowds but still withdrew to pray. He taught multitudes but still rested in solitude, because he understood something many ignore. You cannot pour out endlessly without being filled, and you cannot be filled if you never stop. Obedient rest may feel unproductive at first because your identity has been tied to movement, but over time it produces more fruit with less exhaustion, because it aligns you with God's strength, not your own. When you move in God's rhythm, you will notice clarity increases, peace deepens, reactions soften, discernment sharpens, and endurance grows, because you are no longer running on adrenaline but on grace. Obedient rest also reveals hidden resistance, because when God tells you to rest, whatever argues back inside you reveals what still needs surrender. Some people fear rest because they equate stillness with worthlessness. Others fear it because silence exposes pain. Others because rest removes distractions that keep them from facing God honestly. But obedience invites healing where avoidance created wounds. Obedient rest is an act of faith that says, God, I trust you to work while I stop. I trust you to provide while I pause. I trust you to fight while I wait. And every time you choose rest in obedience, you weaken anxiety and strengthen faith, because anxiety feeds on urgency and faith grows in peace. This is why Jesus slept in the storm while the disciples panicked. He rested not because the storm was small, but because God's authority was greater. Obedient rest changes how you experience storms. They may still exist, but they no longer control you, because you are anchored in God's presence. Rest also protects joy, because joy cannot survive constant pressure. And without joy, obedience becomes duty instead of delight. God never intended obedience to feel like slavery. He intended it to feel like freedom, and rest restores that freedom, because it reminds you that God is a father, not a taskmaster. Obedient rest positions you for longevity. Many people start strong but finish broken because they never learn to rest, and God cares more about how you finish than how fast you start. Sustainable faith requires sustainable rhythms, and sustainable rhythms require rest. When you honor rest, God honors your obedience with strength, insight, favor, and peace, not because you earned it but because you aligned with truth. Obedient rest does not mean you will never be busy. It means you will never be busy without God. It does not mean pressure disappears. It means pressure no longer defines you. It does not mean waiting is easy. It means waiting becomes purposeful, because you know God is working even when you cannot see it. And as you learn to enter God's rhythm, you will realize rest is not something you squeeze into life, it is something you build life around, because everything flows better when God sets the pace, and those who learn obedient rest discover a powerful secret: the slower they move, the clearer they hear, the deeper they trust, and the stronger they become, because rest is not retreat, it is preparation, and those who rest well rise strong. One of the greatest dangers in the life of a believer is not failure, it is success, because failure often drives people back to God, but success slowly convinces them they no longer need Him. This is where many lose God's rhythm after breakthrough, not because God stopped guiding, but because the heart stopped listening. When prayers are answered, doors open, resources increase, influence grows, and visibility expands. Rest is usually the first thing sacrificed on the altar of momentum. People tell themselves, this is just a season, I will slow down later, but later never comes, and what began as blessing slowly turns into burden, because anything God gives that pulls you away from Him becomes heavy, even if it looks good from the outside. Many people pray for elevation but forget that elevation demands deeper dependence, not independence. When God lifts you higher, the margin for error becomes smaller, because impact increases responsibility, and responsibility without rest creates pressure. Pressure without rest creates pride, anxiety, or burnout, and this is how rhythm is lost, slowly, quietly, subtly, not through rebellion but through distraction. The Bible is full of people who handled hardship well but struggled with blessing. Solomon asked for wisdom, and God gave him everything, but over time success multiplied, wives multiplied, distractions multiplied, and rest disappeared. And when rest disappeared, discernment weakened. When discernment weakened, compromise entered, and when compromise entered, the heart drifted. David trusted God in caves but stumbled in palaces, because hardship keeps you close to God while comfort tempts you to relax your guard. Many believers lose rhythm not because they stop believing but because they stop abiding. They replace prayer with planning, worship with work, trust with strategy, and slowly God becomes an accessory instead of the center. Breakthrough introduces new demands, new expectations, new voices, new pressures, and if you do not protect God's rhythm in success, you will lose it in silence. Rest becomes harder after breakthrough because the work feels important, the stakes feel higher, and people depend on you. But the truth is, the more people depend on you, the more you must depend on God. Because leadership without rest turns responsibility into control, and control always replaces trust. When rest is lost, fear quietly takes over: fear of losing what you gained, fear of disappointing people, fear of slowing down, fear of being replaced, fear of missing opportunities. And fear-driven living always leads to burnout, because fear is a cruel master, it never lets you stop. This is why God commands rest, even in harvest seasons, even in growth seasons, even in blessing seasons, because blessing without rest corrupts the soul. Jesus warned, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? And many lose pieces of their soul not in sin but in overcommitment, overextension, and overexposure. Rhythm is lost when identity shifts from sonship to performance, when worth becomes tied to results, and rest begins to feel like a threat instead of a gift. Some people fear rest after breakthrough because rest forces them to confront an uncomfortable truth that God is the source, not them, and pride resists that truth because pride wants credit. Rhythm is also lost when people stop listening to God daily and start relying on past instructions. Yesterday's manna never feeds today's hunger, and yesterday's rhythm will not sustain Today's responsibility obedience must be refreshed daily because seasons change and God's instructions adapt, but those who stop resting stop hearing, and those who stop hearing start guessing, and guessing leads to mistakes that cost years to repair. Another reason rhythm is lost is comparison. After breakthrough, visibility invites comparison, comparison invites competition, and competition destroys rest because you are no longer running your race, you are reacting to someone else's pace. God never called you to match others, He called you to follow Him. But when success comes, voices multiply, opinions increase, and the pressure to keep up intensifies, and without rest you begin to confuse opportunity with assignment and activity with obedience. Jesus never healed everyone, never visited every town, never met every demand because He followed rhythm, not pressure. Many believers burn out not because God gave them too much, but because they took on what God never assigned. Rest is what keeps blessing light and yoke easy because rest filters opportunities through obedience, not ego. Rhythm is also